Hello, everyone. Hope you're having a good Friday. Thanks for joining me for part of it. I'm Greg Swartz. I'm the big man half of the big man Dram. Here is the Dram, which as of last week has returned after a dry month, which is in the rearview mirror now, so I don't need to keep bringing it up. I am very, very excited today because as you may know, we're working on a companion film to the original film, all about independent whiskey bottling. And today we are joined by someone who is going to play a sizable role in that film. So without further ado, please welcome David Stirk. Hello.
Hello. Greetings.
Thanks for joining me on your Friday evening.
Pleasure.
I just finished my lunch here, so.
All right. Yeah, of course. Yeah, it's dinner. Post dinner now. It's the post dinner drink.
Well, I realize this is the first time you and I have ever actually had a conversation. And it's funny because I feel like I've been speaking to you for the last 3 weeks because I've been watching and editing the interview that we did with you, the guy did with you. And so, you've been front and center on my mind, and, the whole time. But yeah, so I'd like, one of the things that I'm very, very eager to talk with you about is what's the exciting times of independent bottling, of whiskey bottling at the moment. What's the Chinese proverb about may you live in interesting times is both a blessing and a curse.
Yeah, absolutely. It is. It's incredible. And I was thinking about this, and I wrote it in the book, that when I started Creative Whiskey in 2005, the largest broker said to me, "You've missed it. You've missed the boat. The good times are gone. What do you think you're doing?" And he reeled off all these distilleries that he says you'll never get to bottle a Brewer or a Port Ellen or a Dallas Dew, and he was right. I never bottled any of those, but I did bottle a Colburn and a Banff and a Glenolbin and Little Mill and all these other incredible whiskies. And to think that's only 2005, it feels 50 years in the industry because of how much has changed, I think. This is now 18 years later, and we have gone from 2005, where let's say there were 20 or 30 bottlers, to now they're, I don't know, 200. Who knows? There's so many independent companies, independent bottlers, independent brands, independent retailers who bottle, independent importers who bottle. There's just everybody. Every man and his dog can now be an independent bottler, and that's all really been within the last sort of 18 to 20 years.
And it feels like this game of chicken where supplies are getting increasingly constrained, and yet there's more and more people hanging out shingles all the time. I feel like something's got to give.
Yeah, it's the Bilbo Baggins quote, isn't it? It's not enough butter spread over too much toast.
Yeah, absolutely.
It does feel that way. And crazy idiots who buy them like Mather, who's got more than anyone else.
Yeah.
It's odd. It's weird. I mean, it's funny how we're having these conversations of limited supply, of impending doom, of the biggest bottler now openly withdrawing, from being termed as an independent bottler, and yet we've never had more companies, more brands, and more variety on offer. So it's a strange juxtaposition, really, isn't it? It's you've got the doomsayers, and I read an article that came out today, I think, on LinkedIn by is it Ian Fraser, and he's quoting, people are quoted in that, saying the end is nigh. We can see the end. And yet I think this part of the sector is incredibly resilient, and it's filled with those odd entrepreneurs and those people that don't fit the mold of the traditional. Well, traditional is the wrong word. Let's say the mold of what the industry has been preaching for the last 20, 30 years, because traditionally it was independent bottlers. But we have those individuals who are such shining lights, who are so unique, so passionate about the category, that for them to be molded into one company wouldn't work for them and would be a crying shame. So I think to say the end is nigh is, you know, in the current business model, yes, but who knows? Things change.
Well, you know, I've been watching 43 different interviews for the independent bottling film. So I have given up any hope of remembering who said what of these little blurbs I get here and there. But one of the things that really kind of came through was this idea that in about, you know, you have all these new distilleries that have been coming online now and selling their first bottlings for about 3-4 years now. You know, there's maybe, I mean, I guess Aaron would have been the first of those, but now there's this whole new wave of a bunch of them. And one of the things, whether it's good times or bad, one of the things that's going to happen in about 6 more years, there's going to be a huge amount of 10-year-old spirit, a huge amount. And that's got to have, some of that has to make its way to the marketplace one way or another. And, you know, more than there's ever been before. I realized that the numbers that you're throughout your book are, you know, staggering at times. And, you know, I've highlighted countless pages and stuff throughout your book because we've been working on a similar subject matter. And one of the things I'm really interested in is the idea that a business that's growing, doubling every decade that's not a sustainable business model for any business.
No. The numbers are staggering. To think in less than 30 years, the industry will have doubled its maturing stock, and yet sales have not gone anywhere near doubling. The forecasting of that, you know, I had a really, really interesting lunch with a guy called Dr. Alan Rutherford, who just one of those sort of unsung heroes, ex-Diageo, ex-IDV. And he pointed out several things that you realize are real common sense. But one of them that stuck to me was every time a distillery, a team gets a new manager, a new marketer, somebody involved, the last thing they're going to do is say, in the next 5 to 10 years, sales are going to go down, because they wouldn't get the job. You know, they'd be straight out the door. What do you mean, sir? We're going to have a smaller market? So the first thing they do is, right, we need to ramp up production because I'm going to revolutionize everything. We're going to get more sales. We're going to do this, that, and the other. And it doesn't always work. And quite often it doesn't work. And some distilleries who have exponentially increased their production have seen zero growth in actual sales, in bulk sales. So you're quite right. Where is all this stock going to go? And the other thing he pointed out that I really make a point of in the book is there wasn't one whiskey lock. We all think a whiskey lock that then broke and independence came along. There were several, and they called it the 7-year itch. And effectively, because it takes for blended whiskey sort of 4 to 6 years roughly for the forecasters to catch up with actual demand, that is roughly a 7-year period. So you'll have a period of a slump, or you'll have a period of an overproduction, and a period of a slump, and a period of an overproduction. And the industry, because of that time lapse, and there's very few industries like this where you have to wait, you almost can't have a period where you can't have that evening out period. You can't say, right, for the next 50 years, we'll never have too much or too little. That's an impossibility. There are things that can happen. And it is quite fascinating, as you say, that we have, I think it's something like 25 more distilleries to come online in the next 2 to 3 years. And in 6 to 10 years, they're all going to have all this amounts of stock. What is going to happen? And you've seen some companies, some of them openly selling half their distillate to an investment firm because they see that as a means of funding the continuation of maybe a short-term period of the distillery. However, when that liquid hits age, that investment company is not a brand builder. Even if they were, all they're going to do is saturate the market of that brand. So that liquid has to find avenues out into the market, and people don't buy casks of whiskey to then just duty pay, stick in their garage and drink like a laird or a lady. That stuff has to get into the bottle, and it has to find a route to market. And it's going to be a very saturated marketplace for some of these companies. And I include some of the bigger, more established brands as well, who have come in more recently. And to an extent, you can view them as an independent entity as well, because up until 10, 12 years ago, a lot of these whiskies were never available. So you could kind of view that in the same way that, bam, they've hit the market. Now they might have aged stock, so they're slightly different, but they still will have the same constraints as to consumer appetite for them, and an oversaturation of just products to choose from. So yeah, if you're looking at the independent sector and saying it's doomed, I think you're misunderstanding what happens to bulk product when it's not needed. And it gets to the point where everyone with cash is a buyer. And that's how the industry was really up until the 90s, the early 90s. Anybody with cash was a buyer. Doesn't matter what they had. If you had cash, you could buy it, lay it down. And we might see a return to that, which could be quite interesting.
And well, we have some interesting comments, but which I'll share in a second. But I don't know if you pay at all. I don't know why you would pay attention to the American craft beer marketplace industry. But for about the last 12 years, big companies, big brewing conglomerates, Anheuser-Busch, AB InBev, chief among them, is that, have been buying up craft breweries. Well, then just about 3 weeks ago, they just announced that 10 of the craft breweries they've bought up, they're just spinning them off and selling them off because, I kind of see that I feel like that's going to happen with some of these brands in the whiskey world, because there's always going to be, this happens in filmmaking, where there's independent, like the 90s was a big time for indie film, and there are all these independent companies, and bit by bit, they all became part of bigger and bigger conglomerates, and, Miramax and Focus, and, they all got bought up by bigger companies. And now there's new companies that have replaced them. There's always going to be that sort of strata. So you stamp it out and it pops up somewhere else.
It happened in Britain. The same thing. We had a huge craft beer industry, and Newcastle breweries and Marston's and the Carlsberg, all these, they just bought them up, closed them down. The reason being, especially in beer terms, is to a certain extent you can make any beer anywhere, to a certain extent. Now that will piss off anybody who lives in Burton upon Trent, but or any Belgians on here as well. But to a certain extent, once you've got that recipe and the brewing know-how, you can shut it down and you can make it en masse somewhere else. And some of our biggest brands say they're from a region, and they're not. They're made, and that was quite an eye opener for me when I found that we did a beer. Actually, it's there. Fun enough, we did a whiskey aged beer quite a long time ago, and the LC Mo that went into this was a Nottingham brewery that was made in Yorkshire. So that was quite an eye opener when I found out that location, because I was coming from a Scotch background, where if that ever happened, that is the end of that company. If you were buying an Arrow and it was made in Fort William, that's the end of that. Good night. But beer, totally different. So yeah, it's I have kind of followed that a little bit in America. I heard it had got to the point where craft brewers were almost giving their stock away to get it on the shelf, because there were just too many, and they hadn't really sat down and worked out route to market. Perhaps got a little bit caught up with the initial interest from people. If you're in a certain state, people might drive 2 or 3 hours to go pick up the latest brew that's been done. That will only last so long, because there's always another one popping up, or another thing, or there's something, the new, the new thing. And I think this is the same for these guys in the whiskey world. You've got these new distilleries popping up, and I think all of them will sell out their first release. Look at Rosal, £125 for a 12-year-old. It will sell out. It will all be gone within a week, 2 weeks. But I think if Diageo were to release a second 12-year-old, £125, that might struggle. And the third one and the fourth one, because the first of everything is always going to sell. After that, that's where the difficulties become. And who knows? We might see some consolidation in this industry. A lot of people have been suggesting that. I've seen some very in-depth sort of business worldy articles about the next big consolidation period for the industry. Could be interesting.
Well, here I'll share some of these comments because this is actually relevant to what you're saying. So with the independent bottling film, I'm co-directing that film with Guy Satchwell, who has been part of our team since the first film, but he and I are doing this together. He's sort of our feet on the ground in Scotland while I'm here, because for a lot of the production of this, I wasn't able to go to Scotland because of the pandemic. So, and Guy says, yeah, I think it's fascinating that the output of distilleries that we think of New Kids on the Block is now turning up in independent bottling. Surprised to see Nick Nan turn up in Little Brown Dog bottlings. Also, Derek said Ardnott Merkin and Annandale. Also, Glasgow Distillery and Ian Croucher released a Glasgow Distillery. I'm sure there's more I'm not thinking of right now, but.
Yeah, and I think maybe Ardnott Merkin can be applauded for ploughing that field a bit with a much more open attitude to their own history. And it's interesting that if you look at all those independent bottlers that bought distilleries, the first thing they did was make it very, very difficult for all other independent bottlers to get their stock. And I kind of hated that, because it was as if their history was dirty. We don't want that. We don't talk about that. And I think that's a crying shame, because it's been the boots on the ground advertising of the independent bottlers that has caused a lot of the growth of this industry. It really has. And I know there'll be people out there in marketing departments and big companies going, that's outrageous. We've done all the hard work. No, I don't buy it. If you go back to the first geeky festivals, I was at the very first Limburg festival. That festival was absolutely furnished by independent bottlers. You take them out of that equation and that festival would fail. There were so many at that first showing, and it was a very harmonious thing. You had a few independent distilleries as well, but it was independent bottling driven. And from that festival to what it is now, and to all of the other ones that have come on board around the world as well, they've done the hard work. So it's great that people like Alex Bruce, Ardnott Merkin have now, they're not being silly about it. You can't just rock up and get a cask. They will allocate a certain amount in a year, and they'll think very carefully about who they want to work with, and there are stipulations and conditions. But I think if you have enough stock, and if you want a very easy hit to your marketing, to your reach, to the people who are interested in you, you go work with a couple of great independent bottlers, and a little bit of scratching of backs can kind of go on.
So in prep for this film, we've interviewed so many bottlers who have now bought or built distilleries, and Guy has asked every one of them that question: Are you going to supply spirit or casks to bottlers?
Well done, Guy.
And it's funny because some of them, Alex Bruce, perfect example, immediately say yes, and then some of them say we don't know yet, we haven't really thought about it yet, and some of them sort of say we don't know yet, but before they say it, they kind of squirm in their chair a little bit. But no one wants to say absolutely not. They might absolutely not, but they don't want to say it that way,
Yeah. I think in a way it's a shame. If you could have had the explosion of the distilleries 10 years ago, before the explosion of casks being seen as a commodity and as an investment, I think you would have seen a lot more cross contamination, a lot more cooperation between the companies, a lot more, tenfold. I think what the problem is now, everybody's very nervous, and they're nervous about wood leaving their warehouse. They're nervous about where it could end up. No new distillery wants to see a cask of their whiskey being offered out on social media with a 15 to 20% guaranteed return. I mean, I say guaranteed. I think that has muddied the waters a bit. And you also have these investment companies who are playing at being independent bottlers as well. So you can go on their website and you can not only invest in a cask with a guaranteed return, but you can also sign up to their bottlings that will come out monthly. And that's muddied the waters. And now suddenly independent bottling has become a dirty phrase because it's been lumped in with these guys who are offering these returns. The people I work with and the people who I've helped and consulted for and trained me, like Alex Bruce, none of those guys would ever sell a cask to the general public, would sell a cask with a return involved. And it's a shame that those, let's say, traditional independent bottlers, people who bring stuff to market, are being lumped in with the other guys. And I think that is causing a real reluctance to work with independent bottlers for fear of what can happen to their liquid once it's out in the open. And I fully understand that. I fully get that.
Sure, absolutely. And it's my mind is swimming with different interviews that we've done, because we spoke to a lot of bottlers who spoke about that, like the challenge of that we're, in a way, we're competing right now with, I'm not an independent bottler, but they're competing with just people who are buying casks and are, willing to pay. They've done no analysis of how to bring this to market. They don't care.
Yeah.
And so eventually those casks will get sold onto the market at some point, hopefully at a huge discount. But it's interesting to see competition coming from that end of this sort of, investment as competitor to a professional bottler, and it's a hard thing to guard against. It's a hard thing as long as the distilleries are willing to sell it,
Yeah. I've got to say a quick hello to Sam Filmus, who's just come on. Hi, Sam. Absolutely wonderful that you've joined us.
Absolutely. I was just talking about Sam this morning, but I'm not going to talk about why. No,
Sam is always good.
I'm going to be near Sam in a couple of weeks. I live in Los Angeles. He lives in San Francisco, but I'm going to be up that way. So our friend Mark Pruitt, who is the editor of Whiskey Network magazine, said, I believe there's new forces at work. Whiskey geeks and the fragmented media have ways of influencing some brands, moving farther into the spotlight than they're prepared to be. Would you agree?
Yeah, absolutely. The greatest ambassadors, marketeers, whatever, are the geeks. I'm not even the best, but I cannot imagine how many people I've dragged into this industry kicking and screaming, because when you're passionate about something, people just almost fail to what are you grinning about? What's so interesting? Why are you traveling off to here and there and doing? There's got to be something more in this than what I believe. And I'm one of millions of these geeks, nerds, whiskey anoraks, whatever it is, and they've done incredible work. As I say, with that first Limburg show, that was populated by independent bottling freaks, geeks, nerds, whiskey aficionados, and you go and see their collections and it blows your mind. And this is in 2000, and when did they start? 2002, whatever it was, the first one. And from that little group of friends in the middle of nowhere, Germany, to now a festival that brings in people all over the world, and Limburg has its own club, and it's just grown and grown and grown. So absolutely, these geeks and the fragmented media and everything, we can bring these brands to audiences that would never have come across them, never discovered them. And even in my little village, I've got a whiskey club. There's 30 odd members, and we had a Nuckneen, and I would say bar one person, they'd never heard of it. One of our guys had been there. The rest of them never heard of it. So the one bottle I bought introduced 30 people to Nuckneen, and those 30 people could, and carry on. And that's free. In fact, I paid for it, so but if they don't embrace that, they're not going to help themselves to a certain extent. I think sometimes they're reluctant to get on board and see the potential of these geeks and nerds and things. Sometimes they want to be mainstream to begin with.
Well, there's so many brands that I believe it was Mark Watt. One of the interviews we did, and I believe it was Mark Watt, said, would whiskey still exist if it weren't for bottlers? Yes, but would the brands you have in your cabinet still exist? Not some of them at all. And like what I'm drinking right now is a perfect example.
Yeah,
I'm drinking a Dalyuan. I mean, I would not know. Come on, focus. There we go. I would, what does Diageo do with Dalyuan? Not, yeah. I mean, publicly, there's hardly any releases. And that's it's actually a real favorite of mine. I really am. I've about 5 or 6 different bottles of Dalyuan. And I know I was showing you this earlier. These are both 9-year-old Dalyuans. And this is a perfect example of what independent bottlers can do. Like these are both 9 years old. One's a Hunter Lang, one single cask nation. Look at the difference in those. It's insane. So, there's someone out there doing a lot of the sort of gospel spreading for these companies, whether they like it or not.
Yeah. And it's funny when I first started getting into independent bottling, which was 24 years ago, the backlash and the sort of negativity around it was this idea from the distillers that they had no control, that the liquid going out was out with their control. They couldn't determine if it was what they would class as good quality or representative of their distillery. It's interesting that attitude has now left the sphere of argument, because every distillery now has a sherry cask, has a bourbon cask, has an Amontillado cask, has a, what you name it, has a tequila cask, a mezcal cask, a worm finish, whatever it is. So they've all embraced, because of the independent bottlers, this idea that there is not one guise for a distillery. And it used to be that they would have a master blender for a malt who would say, this is what we do. This is Lafroig 10, for example. This is exactly as it should be. Anything else is not what we agree with. This is how it should be. Well, now you can get Lafroig in just about every single kind of wood color imaginable, because the geeks and the fragmented media and people like us have said, hang on a minute, I've just had a sherry cask Lafroig from, I don't know, name a company, Douglas Lang, and it blew my mind. What are you doing? Exactly. Yeah. Perfect example. They've got some stunning Lafroigs. And it doesn't take too much of that talk to get marketing people to go, hang on a minute, there's money in this. So as Mark says, without IBs, the industry would still be here, but your single malt selection in your shop would be 1/10 of the size, maybe even smaller, maybe 100th of the size, because the industry was very reluctant to change what they knew, what they were doing. And it took the IBs to say, look, your stuff is good in almost everything, and we're going to show that to the public. And then, they eventually said, oh, we can cash in on this. We can buy into this. Mark's quite correct. Definitely.
Yeah. I spoke with a guy at the, it was in the Inverary, in the Lochvine whiskey shop in Inverary. And we were sort of joking, but I know it would never happen. It wasn't that I was joking, and that I do think it's a good idea, but you would almost think that there'd be some smaller distilleries that could partner up with an independent bottler and say, here's a Lafroig that we did this, and this too. Here's 5 casks that are all crazy things, and then they just kind of track it and see which one does well, and then sort of use them as their research and development.
Yeah. No, that would never happen. But that would be fun. I think the funnest part of it is, Sam, I'll get you one. Don't worry at all. I'm surprised I haven't sent you one. But I think the funnest part of that, and this I can relate to a story again that's in the book. When I did the Malts Advocate course at Royal Lochnagar, Mike Nicholson, who was the manager there, I think he lives in Canada now. He had a cask duty paid that they used as part of the talk, and this was a sherry cask Lochnagar. And I was there with a bunch of other writers. I think Dave Broom, Gavin Smith, Malcolm Greenwood, who's no longer with us, and someone else. And we all raved about it. This thing was just nectar. It was glorious. And Mike was trying to demonstrate that these casks don't fit the requirements of Lochnagar in the blending world. And we were trying to explain to Mike that this is what malt whiskey drinkers want to try. And you've got to remember, this is pre-distillery exclusives. This is pre-managers selection, pre-special releases, pre-all of this. And so we sort of had a fun to and fro with it, to the point where I said, will you sell me the remainder? If it's that bad, let me buy the rest of the cask off you, which he, of course, wouldn't do. But the fun bit, I think, is where you would get an independent bottler with their personality, with their likes to go into a warehouse of a distillery, and be it Ardnamurchan or Knockneen or Glasgow, and taste a bunch of casks, and for them to see the one that the independent would choose. That might give them an insight into all sorts of things. What do independent bottling drinkers drink, as opposed to people who follow brands or preferred, much bigger expressions with much more casks involved. And there'd probably be a bit of correlation, but there'd be a few surprises, I think. There'd be a few casks that maybe they were worried about, whereas an independent bottler would come in and say, that is a knockout. That's something that would fly off the shelves because of its peculiarity, because of its uniqueness. And I think there could be a real crossover of experience and talent's the wrong word, but of choice,
Yeah. Because I think some of the really big distilleries or big groups, conglomerates, try to be nimble in a way that they're not necessarily built to be. I think gone are the days, and I know you and Roy spoke about this a little bit yesterday on the VPub, but gone are the days where someone is going to buy, I only drink a 12-year-old Balvenie, and when it's empty, I'm going to go buy another 12-year-old Balvenie, and when it's empty, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Because what's going to happen to that person is they're going to go to get that second one, and they're going to say, oh, wait, now there's a 14-year-old, or there's this, and there's this, and there's this. And then the next thing you know, they've got 7 bottles. They might all be Balvenie, but they're all, but some of the companies, they can't keep up with that pace. It's just too micro, to.
Yeah, we're all whiskey explorers, and I think you can have favorites. You can collect a series. But even then, how often can you release things that people are going to, how many collectors out there are going to keep things other than Macallan and a few others? It's going to keep a business going if it's just collectors buying it. But other than that, you're right, that statement of I only drink insert brand, that is a generational, that's a generation gone. You never hear that anymore. When I first started doing my tours and tastings, that you'd hear that a lot. And it would often be people 20, 30 years older than me, maybe more, who would say, I only drink Grouse, or I only drink Macallan, or I only drink Highland Park, or whatever it is. That's gone. You just don't hear that anymore. They might reel off their 5 favorite or their 10 favorite, but when you ask them what they're drinking at the moment or what they've got in the collection, it is an absolute plethora. It is a cross-section. It tends to be a bit of IB, independent bottling. It tends to be a bit of proprietary. It also tends to now be a bit of world whiskey. When I first started, the idea that Scots guys would drink bourbon, that was unbelievable. No one in Scotland drank bourbon unless you're a student and you had Coke in it. Now you can get in bourbons that will sell out the day they release. And that's a complete sea change, complete and utter sea change. And it's taken time, but it's because we've lost that generation of, I only drink Scotch, or I only, I can only see the whiskey world in these colors. It's completely changed. And I think IB's there too.
Well, I went to, I was in Kentucky. I was in Bardstown, Kentucky a few months ago, researching what will eventually be a Water of Life about bourbon. That we're working on a number of these things. And we're not filming. We haven't filmed anything yet, but I was just there sort of sniffing around, as it were. And I went into this bar, and it was told, presented to me as being, one of the best bourbon bars in Kentucky, which is saying something, and it absolutely was. And it was, right in the middle of Bardstown. I can't remember the name of it right now, but it doesn't matter. The bartender, we were talking about whiskey, and my friend said something about he drinks Scotch mostly. And she's like, oh, you should talk to Jake. He's our Scotch guy here. And so she brings out this other junior bartender, and we were like, oh, what do you drink? And he's like, Johnny Walker Black. And they're like, what else do you drink? And he's like, no, that's pretty much what I drink. It's like, so that was as far beneath the surface as you could get there. It was, and now, one of the people I'm actually going to have on a guest on this in a few months is Peyton Bell, who works for Peerless in Kentucky, but she is also part of a group. They just opened a Scotch whiskey bar in Louisville, Kentucky, all Scotches, which it was under construction when I was there. So I haven't been yet, but I know it's open now.
It's got brick-proof windows. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. It's underground. It's a bomb shelter. So, Keith Duncan is here now, has joined us, and he has a question for you.
Yes.
In your experience, which distillery is better presented by IBs than under its own brand?
Keith, that's so easy. Kalila.
That's my answer too. That's my answer too.
So I mean, that's the cheating way out, because Diageo don't give Caol Ila much credence, preference, marketing spiel. There's quite a few, but it's sometimes it's a bit unfair, because the distilleries, the big guys, often, as I said before, they'll have a view. They'll have a when you talk about marketing, you've got the is it the 4 Ps: the price, place, people, promotion, product. Well, there's 7 anyway. And so Mortlach would be a good example, because when they redeveloped Mortlach, they had an idea of where it was going to sit, what it was going to look like, what price points was going to come in, and it was almost as if the liquid inside the bottle was a secondary take on the whole package. And then you could quite easily say, well, all Mortlach bottlings from IBs beat the stuffing out of the repackaged stuff. They've cleaned that act up a bit, I think, but it's a bit unfair when it's a marketing-driven product as opposed to independent bottling, which is probably less marketing and more liquid-driven, because independent bottlers are so small, you're only ever judged by your last bottlings. If the last one's a stinker, it's going to take you a long time to build up, respect again in the industry. So, but Caol Ila is an easy one, absolutely.
We actually asked that question to a number of the places that we, a number of the people that we interviewed, and one of the things that, well, 2 parts of that. One was when we were talking to the guys from Single Cask Nation. They were talking about how you can make a mistake as an independent bottler, but if you make 2 with the same customer, they start to create a line, and they think the first one they'll blame the bottle, the second one they'll blame you, and then the third one you're out. But it's somewhere on their conversations, someone said that the Caol Ila spirit is designed by Diageo to be what it is for its major role, and it's not fair to look at it to think of it as it's a Toyota Camry. You shouldn't think of it as a failed Ferrari. It's meant to be a Toyota Camry.
Yeah, that's right. It's a workhorse. That's right.
And it does what it's supposed to do, and it does it quite well.
Yeah. And Diageo, up until 3, 4, 5, 6 months ago, were very honest and open about that, and they were helping independent bottlers. They were open to discussions, to sales, and I think that was very admirable of them to do that, because they didn't have to. They certainly don't need the money. Independent bottlers are a pain in the bum for big boys, because we're moving small numbers of casks out of warehouses instead of absolute tanker loads. So it was difficult for them, but they did it, and they may change their mind and release goods again in the future. But it's a bit rude to pick on them when they were letting stock go with the intention of it being bottled by independent bottlers.
Yeah. And so we started off by talking about the idea that you missed it. You were talking about being told in 2005 that you had missed it, and yet there's still all of these new bottlers coming online. But now I honestly pay fairly close attention to the industry, but I haven't heard this from any official sources. I just was told that even Diageo is cutting back on making Caol Ila available. So I used to joke that eventually seeing the word Isla on an independent bottling was just going to mean it was a Caol Ila.
Pretty much.
Or maybe a Bunnahabhain. But yesterday I was making notes for our conversation today, and I wrote, someone should start a company that only does fillings. They just distill and they just do fillings. They don't have any purpose or intention of ever bottling anything of their own, which I realized 100 years ago there were loads of those. That's all they were ever purpose built.
That's what they were. Yeah. There were no distillery brands. They were all built to do that. That's quite right. It's gone full circle. It's now where they're all making, they can't keep up. We're now making more malt whiskey than grain whiskey. We haven't done that almost since we invented grain whiskey. And yeah, you're right. It began as distilleries distilling to provide anyone and everyone with distillate, whether you're Reverend Tony down the street or whether you're Shivers Brothers on the high street. And now we're at the stage where no one can buy any. You can't rock up anywhere and get anything. Someone else had the idea of that distillery making 20 different, the Rosal kind of thing, making 20, 25 different types of distillate and just selling it as any name, making up like the Loch Lomond experiment, all these 9 different names and everything. The only problem with that is, I think, how do you differentiate them between the independent bottlers? It becomes a cask war. And, we were talking about before we came on, everyone's going, I've got the best cask. Then we've all got the same distillate, and it's just what else are you doing to it to make it interesting? The reason independent bottling works at the moment is you'll never know why Artful Dodger suddenly has a 20-year-old Brewer Claddie, and you'll never know why North Star has a Dalwhinnie, and you'll never know why Watt whiskey has a Tormore finished in a rye. All these things, and it's that mystique and the kind of non-existent paper trail that makes independent bottling interesting. In my case, how on earth did I get 75 Banff? How did you get 1975 Banff? Well, I don't really know. I just know that it was offered it and I bought it. But it's the ability to pick out those incredible little gems here and there. And I think if there was one ring to rule them all, I'll stop with the Tolkien quotes in a bit. We would all be working off the same sort of distillate. It would lose some of that mystique and differentiation that the sector needs.
Well, because that's a fairly common business practice here, with MGP and, just sort of providing spirit to distilleries until their own stuff comes online. And some of them are quite open about it. Some of them are a bit more secretive about it. I mean, I know some of them stupidly take a big hit when it comes out, if they've hidden it before, or not even hidden it, but just not, like High West. I know High West is doing fine, but I know that they were criticized at first for not saying it, on Whistle Pig.
I wonder if that is because in terms of bourbon flavors, you can only have, and I'll try and get the camera, bourbon flavors kind of are within these parameters, and the camera's not big enough for Scotch. And right. I know there might be a few bourbon drinkers screaming blue murder at me, but I love bourbon, absolutely love it. I don't think the parameters of flavor move much beyond a fairly narrow bandwidth. Whereas with Scotch, it can be from the sublime to the ridiculous. Possibly that's got something to do with it. But yeah, it is interesting how, and Ireland is another good example, because Ireland, there are no rules around the labeling. So you can go to a distillery that hasn't made anything and you can find a 10-year-old, and on the label it will say product of X distillery. Mm-hmm. It is, it's all coming from Great Northern or whatever it's called. Scott, we've got rules that really restrict and prohibit those kind of fobbing off, those passing off, as we say in retail terms. And of course, we have a very, very long, rich heritage of independent bottling. So the precedent has been set to a certain example. But yeah, it's fascinating, the American and the Irish. Those two examples are quite fascinating. The general public, the general buying public, to a certain extent, don't care. It's when you get to the geeky, nerdy level, the kind of people who buy single cask, uncolored, or filtered. That's when you can't have those muddied, watered bottlings. You've got to be crystal clear with what you're doing to a certain extent.
Well, so we have a question here that I'm not. Mark Pruitt asks, "Where's the tipping point with independent bottlings, where the source distilleries themselves try to control?" I think, that side, we're beyond that tipping point, right? I mean, that's happening all over the place. No longer sell casks, but farm out own liquid to people who, I don't know that it's being done farmed out. I think it's being done internally, right? What do you think?
No, what we've seen is a huge shift from everything being named to an enormous amount of undisclosed coming out, and no one knows where that's coming from. A lot of the times when they give it silly names, be it Wardhead, Westport, Alduni, whatever it is, we know where it's come from. We know what it is, and I talk about that quite a bit in the book, and I give a very good example. there's a lot more of undisclosed highland, undisclosed island, undisclosed Speyside, undisclosed lowland coming out, and they can be several different distilleries from several different companies. In the last few years have bought stock from different sources via different people, so the distillate is different. One company is not going to be, so let's say it's, for instance, let's say it's Macallan. It isn't, but let's say it is. There's no way that that's coming out of, say, a Tomartin warehouse and also coming out of an Edrington warehouse at the same time of the same stuff. It just isn't. So we've got different distillates. So the industry is getting very coy about clamping down on third-party usage of names for certain distilleries. So that's already happened, and that's been going on for the last 10 years. But you're actually seeing less and less of that stock coming available as well. So I think we are at the point where supply is about as tight as it's ever been. Coupled with that, you have the distilleries themselves now selling casks to groups and parties and individuals, where traditionally that's where independent bottlers were selling. So the most famous one being the 16 million pound Ardbeg, that frankly, if I was Ardbeg, I would never have let anyone in the world know. That press release was one of the strangest things I've ever heard. To openly announce that they're now supporting an independent bottler with the world's most expensive cask, and yet at the same time, LVMH being one of the most protective companies in the world. It's not just one of the most hypocritical things I've ever heard of, but it's just one of the oddest things. That they have a program of selling these expensive casks, of bringing in these millionaires and billionaires and selling these casks. It's as if you can be an IB, you just got to be uber wealthy to do it. And there are lots of companies who have casks of distinction or a VIP program, whereby if you've got enough money, you can come in and you can take your pick. So that's maybe where the tipping point really is. If that dries up and suddenly the prices of these things, and I think I've started to see that happen. One very large company, not in Scotland, has actually disbanded their department looking after that. Possibly because sales are drying up, because people are going, hang on, if there's too much of this around, it's not exclusive anymore. What am I paying for? What is, you're flying me in and treating me like a VIP, but I can get this off the shelf. So that'll trickle down. That's the old Keynesian trickle down economics or whatever it is. And that will knock on and knock on and knock on. The biggest thing really will be, if we have made too much whiskey again, where does that whiskey go? It cannot be blended away, because blend sales have been fairly stagnant for the last 15 years. They really haven't moved. If malt sales don't continue to grow and bulk sales don't continue to go, where does that stock go? That's the really big question. And up until now, okay, India's exploded because they're buying in an incredible amount of bulk whiskey that they mix with their own stuff. But tempered with that is Japan has fallen off the face of the earth buying bulk whiskey. They no longer buy. Japan now buys. India now buys. China has grown quite a bit, but we've all seen their markets not doing well. So the big question as to the future is what's going to happen with this enormous lock of whiskey that we've got kicking about.
And it's funny. Here, before I go on to whatever I'm going to say, but we have another question I want to bring up. Mark Pendlebury says, David, what do you think would need to happen in the future for distilleries to resume cask sales to Indies? Does the market need to bottom out? India no-go, surplus of production, and leave producers desperate to chip away at it?
Yeah, well, yeah, there you go. I mean, Mark is long in the tooth in the industry. My brother from another mother in South Africa. Until we play rugby against each other, then we hate each other. But no, he's quite right. He's quite right. It's all cyclical, isn't it? And the birth of what we think of today as independent bottlers was a surplus of aged whiskey. But the slight caveat with that was there was no appetite for aged whiskey at the time in the marketplace. The difference we have today is we have 30, 40 years of independent bottlers educating the world on how incredible everything from a 4-year-old to a 50-year-old can be. And they've done an incredible job at that. And companies like Cadenheads, Gordon MacPhail, Douglas Lang, Duncan Taylor, who've traveled the world, educating the world on what single cask whiskey can be from every single distillery and grain. That appetite and education is not going to die overnight. So if we do have a surplus of this whiskey, dumping it into the area independents can get it isn't necessarily going to be the salve for that industry. It can't paper over the cracks. If the industry is suffering, the whole industry is suffering, and we'll certainly see a depletion of independent bottlers because the demand will be dropping across the board. It isn't, you can't just say, well, Diageo sales are down, independents can start, pulling the party poppers. It won't work that way. It might have maybe 20 years ago when proprietary bottlings were quite cheap compared to independent bottlings. But now the reverse has happened, and independents are seen as actually the bargain basement, or at least good value. And we've got all these special releases that keep pushing the boundaries of all these prices. So an evening out of prices might occur, but I would suggest if the industry has an issue, independents have an issue. I don't think you can't just tip the lock into the independent pool and watch independents flourish. They'll just be too much. And I think the market wouldn't be there to soak it up.
And also, I think that with so many giant companies calling a lot of the shots now, shareholders aren't going to just sit around and say, well, okay, things are bad, but if we just let this keep aging, it will keep appreciating in value, and it may or may not. But I'm sure some of it will be set aside for that. I think I've heard a couple of people talk to us about that, about wishing in the 80s that they had sort of set on some things longer than they did. Or
well, there's a very, very, very big distillery that obviously rebuilt recently up in Speyside that their sales haven't, and I learned this yesterday from Roy, their sales haven't gone up in 5 years, but their production has gone up exponentially. And that will be to create age statements for which they were famous for, and they can charge huge premiums for. So, but that's just a waiting game. And quite frankly, if the world hits an enormous recession, is the appetite going to be there for $3,000 25-year-olds, or will we see a return to $300 25-year-olds? The problem with that ethos is if everybody's building up age stocks, everybody's building up age stocks. And Neil Clapperton, who was my boss at Springbank, Cadenheads, he said to me, why does a distillery sell their malt at 12 years old? Because they can't sell it at 10. And whilst there's a little bit of argument within that, there's actually quite a bit of wisdom in that as well. No one waits an extra 2 years if you can sell your product. So if we are building up these age stocks, there could be a surplus of it. And will it command the cachet that it does today? Will it command the prices that it does today? Well, that's difficult to know. There's only so many rich buggers out there.
Well, somewhat surprisingly, when we were filming at Gordon MacPhail, they actually showed us some of their old sales ledgers going back to the 40s. And it was the part of it that did my head in was that the older ones were all pre-decimalization. And so even without it, I would have had a hard time adjusting for today's prices. But with that in, I just, I may as well have been trying to read Arabic. And, but basically the point of it was they were showing us examples that there was a time in the 50s and 60s where there was no real perceived cash value increase, whether the whiskey was 5 years old or 30 years old. The difference might be, less than a pound difference. So why would you sit on it? But they did anyway. Maybe out of some sort of corporate obstinance or something, but they did it anyway.
Yeah. It's fascinating because during World War II, and Guy's going to love this because he and I are World War II freaks.
So I'm part of the afflicted.
You're an IC as well. It's fascinating because I was reading all these auction reports, and the older the whiskey was, the price would go up exponentially. So during that period, because it was all heading out to the US, it did become a point of difference. And the most expensive stuff, and I'm pretty sure I've got it listed in the book. I think in Northern Ireland, a batch of 20-year-old or 25-year-old blended malt went for sale, and it went something like 3 times what the value of it should have been in the bottle. It went at auction because A, of scarcity, and B, as I said, people were looking for these things at the time. If you're, America was booming, money was flooding in, everybody was getting rich, and you wanted a point of difference, you would buy 25-year-old Scotch because you wouldn't buy 12. So you've got that period. And then, of course, as you say, after World War II, you had the absolute scramble for grain whiskey. And then you had the period of Scotch being brought to the world en masse, which had never happened before, not in the way it did after World War II. And there was absolutely no credence given to age, because they were scrambling to keep up with stock of whatever it was, Haig, Buchanan, Dewar's, whatever it was, well, most of which didn't have an age statement of any note. So it didn't matter. Everything went in, which is why when you get some of these old blends, they are knockout stuff. Absolutely incredible. Because some of the whiskey in there is 20 years old, 25 years old, whatever it is. And that went up into the 70s. And fascinating chatting to Andrew Simonton at Signatory when he was thinking of starting Signatory, he was meeting these brokers who would meet at Prestonfield House Hotel, where he was I think he was the general manager. And they were bringing in these cask samples of stuff that had no home. And I think the first one he bottled was a 67 Glenlivet. It's crazy thinking about it now. But imagine having sherry casks of 67 Glenlivet and not having a home for them. Well, we don't. We just bring them in to give each other a dram. And Andrew's like, well, can I bottle this? Yeah, sure. I mean, that's more or less how it happened. So they started doing these bottlings. And that's 1988. So that's not a million miles away. It just goes to show that it's all quite recent, this idea of age, prestige, price, premiumization, all that kind of stuff. Pre this period, it was about battling each other over pennies per case of 12 and numbers. How many cases are we selling? Market share, all that kind of stuff. Yeah, fascinating.
Yeah, absolutely. Guy has a question for us, not about the Second World War.
Oh, shame.
I actually have a question about the Second World War, but but what about single grains, Cameron Bridge? I mean, a couple of times recently, I've been momentarily tricked. I just was at K&L Wines the other day, and I saw a 36-year-old independent bottling, and I was like, and it was $149, and I was like, what? And then I was like, oh, it's a single grain. But because I saw the number, because that's the biggest thing, before I saw anything else.
Yeah. Well, independent bottlers have been the champion for single grains.
They're still available, right?
Yeah, it probably is. Although in K&L, they'll have done everything to get it sold out. But
I think I'm saying it's still sourceable.
Yes, to a certain extent. There's getting older grain is okay. There has been a period where younger grain was very difficult to get, but older grain is still available. I've got several here, actually. We'll be bottling a 90 Invergordon shortly. But I think, again, the IB's championed that entire sector. If you take out Cameron Brigg, and it's not Black Bottle, but there was another one. There were the two attempts, really, at the industry to sell grain whiskey. And Cameron Brigg was advertised as not a headache in a glass or something like that, which you wouldn't get away with today, because all alcohol can give you a headache. If it hadn't, I mean, Derek's just said Diageo had a canvas, and they've released a few, Cameron Bridge as well. If it hadn't been for the independents bottling these things, and Duncan Taylor's really one of the companies that needs an absolute shout out for this, because when they bought that Aid Rosenberg stock, the Duncan Taylor stock, there was a huge amount of old grains in there, because the period he was buying in, everyone was buying 50-50. A blend was 50 malt, 50 grain. So if your portfolio didn't have enough grain whiskey in it, it was a pointless portfolio. So they had all these incredible old grains. I think they had Garnheath, and they had 64 Gervins and all these amazing grains, and they were bottling them and selling them. And in the early days, they were incredible value. I mean, less than £100 a bottle for all these things. It has become harder to get grain whiskey, though. Not sure why. I think there was a little period of production lulls, and then things catch up. But it's definitely got a little bit tougher to get the older grains and the more interesting ones as well.
So here, Mark Pendlebury has another follow-up for you. Just did an exclusive port done to 26-year-old from Signatory. Beautiful whiskey, great value compared to what a similarly aged malt costs these days. Yeah, absolutely.
Stop. Hey, Mark, stop advertising your business, okay?
I'm giving you and I some Ian Croucher, I believe, is giving you and I some compliments on.
It's Friday night. This will be Ian's second bottle of red wine, and Ian, I'm guessing you've already bought 2 cars. So I'll be chatting with Zoe on Monday.
So I have 2 quick questions for you. I know it's 2:00 now, or 10:00 for you, so we're meant to be wrapping this up. But I have 2 personal questions for you. Not even my Second World War question. Okay. One is, I understand. I only learned this yesterday watching you with Roy. Is that you're opening a shop?
Yeah, I am in the village I live, Thornhill, north of Dumfries, called Stirk Brothers. Just completely ripping off Shivers Brothers. Absolutely, they can sue me if they want. No, my brother, who's in the other room, he and I are starting a shop, and completely independently minded whiskies, off the beaten track stuff. I have, as you can see, a few people that I know and work with who have been incredibly kind and helpful. I'm very lucky that an independent bottler called Claxton's is down the road, who have very little UK representation. So I work very closely with them. And yeah, it's going to be a fun place. It'll be the kind of place that if you're traveling from the south to Arran for the ferry, or Annandale or Bladnoch, you can drop in, come in, say hello, have a dram, and we'll see how it goes.
That's great. Yeah, no, we interviewed Claxton's for this film. We also, I didn't mention it earlier when you mentioned him, but we had an absolute masterclass with Dr. Alan Rutherford. That was just mind-blowing.
Unbelievable. He is, yeah, and so open, and that's what's lovely about him. You could say, he literally say, "What do you want to talk about?" It's like, wow, that's refreshing. That is, yeah, he's a mine of information and still active at 90. What's he, 91, 90, whatever it is. He's incredible. Yeah.
And he said to us, I don't know what you want from me. I don't remember anything anymore. And then he was like pulling out specific dates from 1986. I mean, it was, yeah. And then correcting himself. No, it wasn't the 13th. It was the 14th. It was crazy. And we're Nate, one of our producers, Nate Barlow, and I were watching that the other day, and Nate was like, "We could just package this as a sort of a masterclass in how to start your whiskey business."
Yeah, I think sometimes we give a lot of, and I'm not going to say necessarily your film's guilty of this, but we give some people a lot of airtime when actually the stars are people who are just lurking around and enjoying life. But Alan's still involved. He's chairman of the new Northumberland distillery. Worked very closely with Compass Box. He worked with Elixir to find the site on Isla. So, I mean, this guy's still incredibly active, and yet, not many people know who he is, and he just has a happy life, just a fantastic guy. Frank McCarty would be another one.
Well, there, guys watching, there you go. There's another interview. We could slate it, put it on the slate. We just set up an interview today with Andrew Smith.
All right, okay.
But
could you do me a favor? Could you dress him in a green suit and give him a cucumber to wield while you're doing the interview? You might not know the reference, but you can Google it later.
Well, I saw a reference to that in the chat yesterday.
Yeah.
Something about gherkins. I don't know.
Yeah. just you'll find it on their social media page, but it was a bit of a stitch up. Yeah.
So my only other question for you then, and this is only if you want to, I don't know where normally I would ask you ahead of time, and I simply forgot because you didn't talk about it and it didn't occur to me, which is, where can people get this if they'd like to get your new book? Because it's fantastic.
Yeah. Thank you. It is available at a few shops, but it will obviously be available at the new shop, Stirk Brothers. It's but you can just email me. You'll find me. Just Google my name. You'll find me. You can email me, and people can get it. Sam, I'll send him a copy. He deserves one. He's in it, so he should definitely read it because he's featured in it. But yeah, it's out there. You just Google independent Scotch, David Stirk, you'll find the book. But if not, email me and we'll sort you out.
Yeah, it's a great read, and I feel like it helped me making this film because while it came out right, well, we've been working on it for 2 years, so it came out in the middle of that. And
what was funny is I think I received it the day Guy arrived to interview me.
Cool.
I think I gave Guy a copy, or he bought one, or whatever. But I think it was there literally the day he arrived to interview me. So it was incredible. But I did threaten to put it behind me all over, but that wasn't allowed. I'm not that kind of self-promoter.
Well, thank you so much for talking with me. This will all be online, so people can watch it later, and I will refer to it later as well. Not just that, but also the last night's VPub and the book. You've been a huge help for our film on camera as well. I mean, your interview was great, and it's been really exciting getting to know you and talk about whiskey with you.
Thank you very much.
I will look you up when I'm in Scotland next.
Cool.
Which will be sooner than later. Well, cheers. Thanks, everybody. Have a good Friday. Cheers. Solange.